All right, good evening, everybody. You guys got a little preview of Intro to Web Dev with me accidentally having my webcam on and not realizing it. So welcome to the chaotic world of Lambda School's Intro to Web Dev. My name is Diandra Ryan Moss, and I'm your instructor for this course. So I'll be with you this week and next to teach you all about web development. I'm teaching you guys tonight live from Bisbee, Arizona, which is basically the edge of the universe. And it is a lovely night here. So I'm looking forward to doing some JavaScript with you, or not JavaScript yet, some web development. We'll be doing JavaScript later this week. But tonight we're going to be talking, a little more high level. So tonight's lesson will be a little more talky than codey, just to get you guys all the foundations of the structure of this class and the structure of Lambda School as a whole, and then we'll jump into some coding at the end of the class. And as you'll see moving forward, starting tomorrow night, we'll get to the coding a lot sooner. We just have some housekeeping items to do tonight. On that note, a lot of you guys have already seen the attendance form that's floating around in Slack. Definitely fill that out. That's a one-time thing. You just need to fill it out tonight only. That will help us track your progress in this course. So let's get to it. All right, so before we start on anything, I want to start with a question to you guys. And my question is, what does it mean to be a software engineer? So feel free to throw out any responses you have in the chat part in Zoom. And the first answer is already excellent. Always be learning. To code programs, develop software, problem solver, critical thinker, build cool stuff. It means we are powerful people. I like that one too. Cool. So we have a variety of responses here. I see a couple responses in referring to creativity coming up. Problem solving is a big response. There's some obvious ones. If we build software, we write code. And I actually really love that very first answer, which is that you're always continuing to learn. So those are all relevant, and we're going to talk about all of those in this course. And that's a complicated question of what does that truly mean? And for me, the number one thing that I'm trying to get you guys to answer for yourselves over the 8 nights of this course is that question, because of course this course is all about teaching you some of the fundamental skills of web development, but more importantly is teaching you how to think like a web developer, what it means to be a web developer, and letting you guys try on those shoes. Because I know a lot of you are considering making a very big commitment to Lambda School to switch your lives and your careers. So we want you to be able to try it on first. On that note, I want to talk to you a little bit about Lambda School's main curriculum. So for anyone here who's just interested in learning a few technical skills, that's totally awesome. We're happy to have you. But I know many of you are either interested in Lambda School or curious about Lambda School. So every night I'll talk to you a little bit more about the school and a different component of life there. So as an overview, Lambda School is an entirely online web development and computer science. Sorry, I'm getting a little message that some people are missing the link. So let me pause my speech so I can make sure everyone joins. 1 second. All right. Oh, and I already see it posted. So, all right, good. Anyone? So hopefully we'll have some more people joining us in just a minute here. So anyways, Lambda School. It's a full-time online web development and computer science immersive. And it's pretty revolutionary in a couple ways. So first of all, immersives are this awesome thing that's been popping up over the last 5 or so years. The CS degree was kind of notoriously this 4-year slog where you don't actually learn any of the real skills that you use on the job. So immersives in general are a really powerful alternative. And I will just say from the get-go that when I was working at a company and interviewing people, I found pretty consistently that the candidates coming from a traditional CS background did not have the skills that we needed, whereas students coming from other boot camps with a curriculum like Lambda Schools actually knew the things that we were doing. We could talk to them about what we were doing in our day-to-day, and they knew what we were talking about. So in general, immersives are pretty awesome and revolutionary. But Lambda School takes it to the next level on a couple accounts. there are two things from my perspective that make Lambda School really special. The first is that it's entirely online. So it's all online, which means that it is accessible to anyone, anywhere, as long as you have an internet connection. That's really meaningful to me because I live in Bisbee, Arizona, and there's no way I would be teaching tech if I couldn't teach it online. And what's even better about that is that we do a ton of live instruction, interactive. It's not like you pay us and we give you some videos that were recorded 2 years ago. You're experiencing a classroom setting from the comfort of your own home. The other thing that makes Lambda School really revolutionary is that we have a deferred tuition model. So also in the spirit of trying to get this education accessible to as many people as possible, we know that one of the biggest barriers to immersives is that there's this giant price tag on the front of it. And if you can't, call up your rich aunt or get private funding, there's pretty much no way that you can join. Most of us don't have $20,000 sitting around. But Lambda School created a model that circumvented that issue, which is that we have a deferred tuition option. That means you pay us zero up front and you only start paying us once you are hired. So tuition is due if and only if you get a job in the tech industry making $50K or more. So you only start paying us for tuition after you are hired. And furthermore, tuition is a percentage of your job or of your salary. So you're not overpaying us for, if you end up not getting as high of a paying job. So a couple pretty cool things about that. Beyond all the logistics of that, the curriculum is centered around web development. We'll talk a lot in just a minute about what those tools really look like and the kinds of things you'll be learning. And then, sorry, my Slack is blowing up, so I'm just going to close it up. All right, so yeah, you'll be learning in detail all the things that we just touch on in this intro course. So we'll talk more about the actual curriculum here. As far as your day-to-day life there, it's a blend of live lectures like this, homework time, Q&As, group work, projects, etc. I'm just stumbling all over myself tonight, but that's all right. So that's Lambda School for you. If you are interested in applying or just learning a little bit more about the application process, please reach out to Karen Zachary in Slack. She is the admissions guru and she can answer any admissions questions that you have. I'll answer any questions you have about admissions and otherwise at the end of this course, but I'm really not the best person for that particular section. So if you want to know more or start that process, reach out to her. And I will say that if anyone out there has quite a bit of Java experience or a medium amount of JavaScript experience, you might be able to get that process rolling and get accepted now. Most people wait until the end of this course to apply, but if you have some experience, feel free to start that process whenever you are ready. All right, so let's switch gears and talk about what we're going to talk about tonight, which is what is programming, what is web development, and how do we write code. So before I get into that, I just want to give you a brief background on me. I really started coding in the most primitive sense when I was 14 years old and had terrible insomnia and decided to mess around with HTML and CSS in the middle of the night instead of sleeping. And then, my grades suffered, yada, yada, but it all worked out in the end because I ended up first getting a math degree in college and did some programming there, but then I went through an immersive in Austin, Texas, worked in the industry for 2 years doing some web development and a lot of data aggregation work. And now I am here at Lambda School because I love teaching you guys and it's super exciting to see a whole new generation of software engineers at the beginning of their journey. So that's a little bit about me. I'll always try to mix in some of my real world experience when talking to you guys, and you're welcome to always reach out to me in Slack if you have any questions or comments for me specifically. So let's go ahead and what do I want to talk about next? Let's talk about the layout of this course. So the layout of this course is pretty simple. Each night has 3 sections. The first section is the lecture. The lecture runs about an hour. Oftentimes it'll run an hour 15, especially if you guys have good questions, and I love questions. And then the next hour or so is meant for homework. So I will just warn you right now that especially if you are just beginning to code, the allotted homework time is not always enough to do the homework. So the reason I'm telling you that is because I don't want you guys freaking out if you can't quite finish the homework in the allotted time, or if you only get halfway through. That's pretty common, and a lot of students end up having to work on it a little outside of class. But we want to make sure that you have at least an hour or so to focus on it right after the lecture. And during that homework time, you'll see lots of people chatting in Slack with each other, pinging off of each other for help with that. So it's a really good time to work on the homework because everyone's there and everyone's involved. The TAs are present. And then so the last piece of the class happens at 7 o'clock. So at 7 o'clock, we have what we call our daily stand-up. And it is a group meeting in Zoom. A Zoom link will go out at 7, and people will be split within Zoom into smaller groups where you can discuss the homework. This section of the night is also really important and really valuable because it allows you to come back together and discuss what you've learned. You can receive help on the things you struggled with or share your knowledge with the other students receiving help. And I think that this section is particularly important given that this is an online class because we're all in our isolated little bubbles. And if we're struggling, it's easy to start to assume I'm having a hard time with this, but everyone else is just doing this super easily. And I will say that sometimes the students who are doing well like to be more vocal on Slack, which is fine, but it gives you this false sense that everyone's, breezing through it when you're struggling. So these stand-ups are a really great time to actually connect with your fellow students and see, hey, we're all in this together. So I encourage you to stick around for that. Technically, all pieces are optional in that we post the videos online. So some people choose to take this at their own pace. We really recommend taking it in person and taking it, it just helps you stay on track better. But if you have to miss a night or two, everything will be available. And on that note, the videos do get uploaded each evening. There's a little delay just for rendering and uploading time from when the course ends. But you're always welcome to search on YouTube for some of the older lectures if you want a video for reference and the current night isn't up yet. If you're having trouble finding anything on Lambda's YouTube, just reach out and we can help you find those links. Okay, so that is all the housekeeping stuff. Oh yeah, one more in case you guys don't know. The class runs Monday through Thursday this week and next week, starting at 5 Pacific. So I think you guys know about the 5 Pacific since you made it here. But yes, so Monday through Thursday, no class on Friday. All right, that is all the housekeeping items. So now I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start talking about coding. So give me just 1 second. Oh yes, one more thing is that if you have questions, I often ask for comments or feedback in the chat, but if you have any formal questions for me, please put them in the Q&A section in Zoom. So the Q&A questions will be answered by the TAs throughout the night, and then any that are left over at the end, I will answer when the lecture is over. So make sure those questions go in the Q&A. I try and pay attention to chat, but often actually I miss a lot of the chat stuff. All right, so now we are going to talk about coding. Oh yeah, here's the syllabus. There's a syllabus too. If you need that link, let me know. And Lambda School's websites, and let's get a code base up. Cool. So I'm starting out with just some code on the screen. And at this point, you're not expected to know what this does, how to write it, or even what language it is. But we're going to use this little piece of code to guide you guys through this kind of fundamental idea of how do we think about code and how do we think about programming. Well, to start, if you're writing code, the first thing you probably need is some sort of problem or task. There are quite a great varieties of different problems and tasks that can be solved with code. Anything from building a website, creating an artificial intelligence chess player, storing and retrieving data from a database. These are all problems that could be solved by code. Each of these problems you would need a different skill set and different languages to solve, but they're all codable problems. So we're going to start out with a problem that we want to solve as a group. This problem is, how do we create a simple web page that just has a header and a paragraph on it? So if we want to solve this problem, the first question we need to ask is, what language can we use? And in many cases, there are lots of different languages that might be appropriate. But in this case, in the case of trying to create this basic website, there's pretty definitely one language we want, and that language is HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language, which is one of the languages we'll be learning in this course. Hypertext Markup Language is a language that is specifically designed for building and rendering web pages. So now that we know what language we want to use, there's this question of how do we write it? And when you're working with different languages, one of the first questions you might ask is, what type of language am I working with? HTML is what's called a markup language. Markup languages are a little more simple. They're used for rendering data. They're not as advanced or versatile as programming languages. Examples of programming languages would be JavaScript, which we'll learn in this course, or C, Java, Python. All of those are programming languages. And when we get to JavaScript on Wednesday, we'll talk more about what exactly is involved with programming language. For now, remember that HTML is a markup language, which means that it is used for rendering content. All right, so we know that HTML is a markup language, and we know that it's going to be a good language for this problem we want to solve of creating this basic web page. So the next question is, how do we write HTML? When you're trying to figure out how to write a language, write code in a language, there are a couple different things to keep in mind, and these things are universal no matter what language you're working with. The first is keywords, and in my text editor here, we can see that the keywords are highlighted in pink, which makes them easily identifiable. These are words that are actually built into the language and are a way of cueing to the computer that you want to do a specific thing. Every language has keywords, and you will need to know at least a handful of them to get off the ground. The other thing that you'll have to learn when working with a new language is called syntax. And syntax is basically how do we structure a sentence or a command. We could think of each line on here as being a command that we're giving to the computer to do something. And so these only work out if our syntax is precise. And the syntax really has to do with how we structure keywords with symbols. For example, we can see that there are lots of brackets involved in this code. And these brackets are a pretty key syntactical component of HTML. We can also see that there's some of these slashes within these brackets, also a syntactical component. If I were to mess this up, if I were to change the style of bracket or have the slash facing the wrong way, that would all create issues in this code. So we really need to be precise when writing code. This is one of the first steps to starting to think like a software engineer or programmer. So when you're texting your best friend about drinks at the bar, if you accidentally spell something wrong or leave off the punctuation, they're still going to know. They are still going to know what you mean. Humans have an ability to, even when the syntax or the grammar or the spelling is messed up, to figure out what you meant. But code is not the same. Notice up here it says the word body. If I accidentally spelled that wrong, this would break. So computers do not have this faculty to figure out what you meant the way humans do. So you need to be precise. And I can tell you that a lot of your time and energy in the next 2 weeks is going to go to trying to figure out, okay, why isn't it working? All right, the bracket was slightly in the wrong place, or the semicolon was misplaced, or I spelled something wrong, or the parentheses weren't closed. All those seemingly arbitrary issues become really important when you're writing code. On that note, as we learn how to do different things throughout this course, I will be heavily emphasizing what the correct syntax is to help you guys learn that. All right. So the next step, once we know what our language is and once we have some ideas of how to use our language, is we have to run our code. So once we've used the tools of the language to write up some commands, we need to run it. So up here, I've pre-filled this out for us. I've set up a few lines of code here, actually 7 lines of code to be specific, that all say, create a web page with a header that says code example and a single paragraph that says this is a paragraph on a web page. But when I just have this sitting out here on its own, then that's not too helpful. So I've created a set of instructions, but I haven't executed them. This web page will not be created until I run this code. And how to run code is going to depend. It's going to depend on what language you're using or what thing you're trying to accomplish. And it's easy to neglect thinking about how the code actually runs. Sometimes it happens for us behind the scenes, but it's an important thing to ask yourself because it will help you really understand what's going on. So we will keep coming back to this idea of how is the code run. When it comes to HTML, running the code is actually pretty simple. All we have to do is open the file in any browser. So any web browser is designed to read HTML. So if we just go File, Open, I'm in Chrome. You can do this in any browser. Here is pindex is this file that I have open here. So I'm going to open it. And now we see that our code has been transformed into a web page. So here we have it. We can see that our code was successfully written because we have a very basic web page with a header and a paragraph. It's not the most interesting web page. It's not that visually appealing, but there it is in all its glory. So we have seen how to write code and execute code with this simple example. And as we'll be learning HTML tonight, by the end of tonight, you'll understand what exactly is going on in this little document. To break it down for you in a basic way, the first line says that we are going to create an HTML document. The next two lines essentially just set up the foundation of our web page. These two lines, this first one creates our header and puts the text on it. This line, which is wrapping around a little, creates a paragraph and puts the text in that. And then these last two lines let the computer know that we are finished with our web page. So that's just a basic idea. The code can look a little intimidating at first. Even to someone like me who has been coding for years, when I see a new code base, there's always this moment of, oh geez, what's going on here? And I will say that that moment of what's going on here is one of the keys to mastering coding. You have to learn to be comfortable with that feeling because you will experience it again and again. But it turns out that if you just break down every line individually, there is a system of logic and reason that all builds up to whatever your code is trying to accomplish. All right, so let's talk. We've been talking about programming in general. And while I've used this HTML example, everything I've said applies to any language you're using or any problem you're trying to solve. You figure out your problem, you figure out which language or languages will be needed to solve it. You make sure you understand the syntax and keywords and rules of that language. You use the language to write out a script that solves it. You execute it. And then presumably you spend like 8 hours trying to debug it because it isn't quite working as planned. That was the step that we did leave out here, since this is simple enough that there were no bugs in it. So that's the basic format. But now I want to switch focus to web development in particular. So web development is the topic of the hour. That's what we are going to be covering in this intro course and what you'll be learning in Lambda School's main curriculum should you choose to attend. So web development is a subsection of programming, and it's all about creating content on the web. So that means websites, web apps. It does not include mobile apps. Mobile development is its own field. However, there is a lot of overlap between the two, and I know a lot of people who were trained in one and ended up working in the other. So let me talk about the three languages that are basically the beating heart of web development. And I'm going to hop on over to Lambda School's website so we can show some examples for each. So the first one is HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, which you were just exposed to. And as you saw in this basic example, it's used for rendering content on your web page. So all of the text on this website was created using HTML. Even the button was created. All of the images were put on using HTML. Menu bars, any sort of structural content is HTML. The next language that is important to web development is called CSS. And CSS is the reason that this little example here looks so ugly. It's because CSS is what makes our websites beautiful. CSS is responsible for the styling. So the reason this button is red is CSS. The reason that there's all this nice white space in between our header and the top of the page and in between the side, that's all CSS. The different fonts, CSS. The fact that this text is white and the drop-down text is blue, that is all CSS. And we will be talking about it very briefly tonight, but we will mostly be covering CSS in tomorrow's lecture. The final component of web development is JavaScript. And from a user's perspective, JavaScript seems to play a minimal role in websites. But from a developer's perspective, JavaScript is mostly what we do. So JavaScript is the powerful engine behind every interactive website. So a static website, a website that there's no buttons, there's nothing responds to you as a user, might not have JavaScript, but those websites are few and far between in the modern age. So let me show you a few examples of JavaScript. Notice how the color of this button changes when I hover over it. Notice how when I hover here, there's a drop-down menu, and these colors change as well. These are all some simple examples of JavaScript, the type of things that we've learned to take for granted, but that someone somewhere had to actually code in. So one of the big challenges I have for you guys over the next 2 weeks, and maybe the rest of your life, is that when you're using the internet, don't just think about the websites you're using as a user. Think about them as a developer. Think about all these subtle little features like the white space on the side of your page or how the color changes slightly on a hover. Someone thoughtfully put all those touches in using one of these 3 languages. So the other piece of JavaScript, and really the biggest piece of JavaScript, is JavaScript helps manage data flow on websites. So the Lambda School site is not the best example, but I'd like to use the example of social media. So you get on your Twitter account, and first of all, somehow Twitter magically knows what to display on your feed. Hopefully it's showing you all the most recent tweets by the people you follow, or I actually don't even use Twitter, so I don't know what else it shows you. But so you get on Twitter and you see all these tweets from people you follow, and they're actually structured in the order that they came in, and new ones are appearing. And if you want to like something, you can click on it and immediately the like count goes up. If you want to comment, you can do that. If you want to write your own post, it will not only be saved, but also start to appear on other people's feeds. There's a ton of logic going on behind the scenes that's managing this data. It's making sure that when you submit something, it's stored in a database. It's making sure that everything that's appearing on your feed is what's supposed to be. It's making sure that your tweets appear in the places they belong. It's connecting hashtags. All of that logic is done with JavaScript. So behind the scenes, there is this whole data management problem. And this is very much the part of the web development iceberg that we can't see from the boat. And so in this course, from Wednesday of this week all through next week, we'll be studying JavaScript. So JavaScript is a programming language and is thus a little more difficult to master than CSS and HTML. So we'll be spending a lot of time laying the foundation for how to write JavaScript so that you guys can build up to using it to do these types of data management tasks and data flow tasks in your projects within the main curriculum. All right, so that's web development for you. As far as two key terms that come up a lot with web development are the terms front end and back end. And once again, this is a big shift from thinking about websites and the web as a user. Because as a user, the front end is the only thing you see. So the front end involves everything we just talked about. So all the HTML and CSS happens on the front end. Some JavaScript happens on the front end, such as these dynamic elements or, the interactivity of submitting something. That's all front-end web development. But as I've just explained, there's also an entire world of web development that we don't see, and that's the data side of it. That is called back-end web development, and it's mostly JavaScript. It actually can be written in other languages beyond JavaScript, but JavaScript is quite popular for back-end. There's also there's the language SQL or some other database languages that are involved in the back end. So you need to interact directly with the database when you're writing back end code. So unfortunately, we will not be covering back end web development in this intro course, which makes me sad because I'm a data nerd and back end is my favorite, but that is something you will learn all about in the main curriculum. And as it is generally written in JavaScript, the tools that you're learning to prepare you for front end JavaScript will also help you with back end JavaScript. Okay, so that's web development for you. let's go ahead and pop open a code base so that we can talk about how these three languages work together. So here's my code base. And one thing I also wanted to mention is that the program I'm using to pull up these code examples is called Sublime Text. It's a text editor. There are a few free text editors that are really nice. I like Sublime. Atom and VS Code are also great. You will not need a text editor for this course. You'll see why in a minute. But if you want to play around with some of these ideas, you're welcome to download and use a text editor. Like I said, there are several that are free and are totally awesome. And admittedly, even though we won't be using a text editor in this course, text editors are quite important when you are programming. So in the main curriculum, you will be using text editors quite a lot. In the job, you will be using text editors quite a lot. So, and as far as where to download, I would just, I see a request to repeat these: Atom, VS Code, Sublime Text. Just Google any of them and you will find them quite quickly. And I already see people discussing CodePen. So CodePen is not a text editor. It's what's called a sandbox environment. We'll go over that in just a minute, and that's what we'll be using in this class. It works a little bit different than using a text editor. All right, so in this code base, oh yes, let me define code base for you. Code bases are going to be your best friend once you're on the job. A code base is just a collection of files that all work together to accomplish some end goal. So if you're trying to create an AI chess player, you would have a bunch of files all in one folder or code base that all interact with each other in order to create the logic. We use code bases because if we were just writing all of our logic on one page, it would be awful and impossible to find anything. So we like splitting things up. Another reason to use code bases is when you have different languages working together, they each need their own file. There are some ways around that, but we really recommend every language has its own file. It keeps life simple. And in this code base, we see that there are 3 files. And based on the file extension, we can see that one is HTML, one CSS, and the last one is JavaScript. So, and as you might imagine, this code base is a website. So all 3 of these files work together to render a simple website. Not quite as simple as the last one we saw, but still pretty simple. So here's just a little mini example of a code base. I can tell you that the ones that I've worked with on the job generally have like 8 or 10 folders over here, and then you open them and there's like 8 or 10 folders in those, and they're endless pits of code. So 3 files is very manageable. But you will have to get used to working with hundreds, if not thousands of files at once. This is why I said that being comfortable with the great unknown is one of the key components of being a web developer. You will experience code bases that are far more complex than you could hope to comprehend, at least in the first few weeks of working with them. This one is a little simpler though. So let's talk about these 3 languages, do a little review of what they each do, and we can see a little example of the syntax for them. So we can see that the syntax for HTML, as we already kind of explored, involves a lot of these brackets. So we have these little elements that we create and then we close them out later. We'll be talking in just a minute on a little more detail on how that works. CSS, however, involves the curly brackets and sets of these pairs that are separated by semicolons. JavaScript is a little more chaotic. We can see that there are equal signs, semicolons, brackets, parentheses, and this const keyword seems to come up a couple times. So don't worry about the syntax, especially for JavaScript. We'll be going over that starting Wednesday. The big takeaway I want to show you is that just by looking at these files, we can already tell that these things are different languages. So it's easy to tell a different language apart. You can usually tell just by looking because the symbols and formats and syntax are all going to be a little different. So let's look at the code base that we've created here. So we have this web page. I'm going to do a side-by-side here. We have this web page and a code base that goes with it. So, all right, I've already given you guys a little sense of what HTML, JavaScript, and CSS all do. Can anyone within the Zoom chat window tell me on this web page that I've pulled up, What's an example of HTML? What's an example of CSS? And what might be an example of JavaScript? The text is HTML. The more specific you guys can say, the better. All right, the blue color, great. The title, the blue square, the font. Oh, I see the word padding thrown out there. So the space in between here, that's CSS. One thing that I saw that was pretty cool, or that was an interesting comment a few of you have made, is that the button is JavaScript. So that is kind of true and kind of not. Technically speaking, the button is not JavaScript. It's actually HTML. And in fact, we can see the line of HTML where the button is created. So the button itself is not JavaScript, but what happens when I click it is. So notice that the page actually changed dynamically. There were some missing words on the screen, and when I clicked the button, they appeared. So subtle distinction, but important one. The button itself is actually HTML, but what happens when the button is clicked is JavaScript. Awesome. So it sounds like you guys have a basic understanding of the difference between the three. So I feel like I've done my job well up until this point. Let's see what happens next. So we've talked about these three languages. For the rest of tonight, I'm going to switch my focus over to HTML. We'll be learning CSS tomorrow night and then JavaScript starting on Wednesday. So to talk about HTML, the first thing you need to understand is elements. So we can start by just looking at this page or looking at this code. Every time we see a little bracket like this with two brackets and something in the middle, we've created an element. Every time we see the same thing but with a slash through it, we've ended the element. So just by looking at this code, we can start to see that these elements are actually stacked inside of each other. We start the body element here, but then a bunch of elements are created and finished before we get to the close of this. And on that note, you could think about HTML as being a bunch of boxes stacked inside of each other. And HTML pages tend to have a kind of boxy look to them. So in the background here, we see the body. All this white space is going to be the body. That's one of our outermost elements. Stacked inside this is this blue box, which is called a div. Stacked inside of that is actually a header. We can't see as well that this is a box because there's no border or background around it, but it actually is a box, and we will play with that a little bit and once we get into CodePen. This paragraph here is another box, and we could even think about this button as being a box as well. So it's just a collection of these boxes. To show you another visual to help get the idea, here's where it gets tricky. When there's no style on it, it can be pretty tough to see where the boxes are because our text appears, but the boxes are invisible. So here is a extremely colorful, kind of obnoxiously colorful diagram that actually corresponds to what's going on this style list page. So in the background of every single web page is an invisible element called the HTML element. It's like the invisible container that contains everything else. Beyond that is what's called the body. And every web page has the HTML element and the body. The body is just your background. So even this space down here where nothing's happening, that's the body. So you start to put your customized elements inside of the body. Up here, I've started with a header, this orange header element. We can see that it says header 1 here. So there's actually this box, invisible box containing this header. Below that box is what's called a div, and the div is completely invisible. There's actually a box and then a second box inside of it. So this is where you have to be careful. A lot of these things are invisible and you can't see them from the web page alone. But based on the diagram, we can see that there's actually this container, and inside of that, the paragraph. It turns out that these two elements are in another container. There's a div box containing both of these, and within those, we have another header and a paragraph. So we'll be hopping into CodePen in just a second, and you guys will get to see how this actually works when you write it out. But the most important takeaway right now, the two most important takeaways are, one, that web pages are just made up of these things called elements, and they're basically boxes that we can stack inside each other or stack next to each other. with the wonders of modern web development, we can put them side by side too sometimes, but for now, just think about them as we can stack them vertically or horizontally. And then the last thing I want you guys to remember is that these things can be invisible. So don't make any assumptions about how many elements are actually on your page, because there tend to be a lot more than you'd think because some of them are invisible. So let me hop over into CodePen and we can finally start our coding. That's not CodePen. This is CodePen. Let's create a pen. Okay, so a cool thing about CodePen, let's talk about CodePen for a minute. As I said, CodePen is not a text editor. It is a sandbox environment. So remember how when we created that page, we had to actually type it out, save it, and then open the file in our browser. That's kind of a pain in the butt, especially if we're just trying to play around. So CodePen is a shortcut. How CodePen works is the section over here actually mimics a text editor. So we have this mimicked text editor over here, and then a mimic web browser. And how it works is that as you write your code, this updates live. So this fake web browser here will instantly reflect the code you're writing. So a sandbox environment like CodePen is not really where you want to be writing some big project or a website you intend to put live. But it's a really good teaching tool, it's a really good learning tool, and it's a great debugging tool. So if you have a small chunk of code that you want to play around with, it's awesome to have it in CodePen because you can just see how the code looks immediately. So that is CodePen for you. I will be teaching in CodePen tonight and tomorrow, and you will be using it for the homework as well. Okay, so let's talk about how to actually write some HTML. And I'm going to get rid of this awful colored diagram. One other thing about CodePen actually is that, remember how I said that the HTML element and the body element are kind of these obligatory elements that every single website has? Another shortcut that CodePen provides for you is you don't need to worry about those. So I do like it to introduce you guys to those concepts because if I'm teaching you HTML, you should at least be familiar with those terms. But you won't ever have to worry about creating either of those tags in the homework, and I won't be creating them in the lecture here because they're not necessary inside of CodePen. So let's start with a header. In order to create an element, you need what's called an opening tag and a closing tag. And the opening tag says we're starting our element, the closing tag says we are finishing it, and anything that goes inside of it needs to go in between the two tags. Sometimes that will just be text, but as we've seen in the code example, you can also put more elements inside of other elements. Remember, they're stackable. We can nest them inside each other. So as far as syntax goes, we need to know what elements are available to us. So there are preset elements that exist within the HTML language. Elements aren't something we're coming up with on the fly. We can create them, but the types of elements are all preset and built into the language. So, and this brings me to another really good point, which is that there's a lot of stuff that's built into these languages that you have to use. And I think a really common mistake for new developers is to think that they need to memorize all these things. I personally hate memorizing. I think memorizing is a waste of time, and I'm just bad at it. So I am like the #1 advocate of don't memorize anything you don't have to because you can look it up. So I think the #1 skill that you need to know in this class is Googling. And this ties into that comment that was made about what it means to be a programmer and this idea of you're always learning. So there's two sides to always learning. One is you're acquiring new knowledge that sticks in your brain. But there's another side that might not be exactly considered learning. And that's the ability to quest for knowledge. So your most important skill, I'm dead serious about this, your #1 most important skill is your ability to find information. So I will be encouraging you throughout this class. When you are stuck on something, the first place you go is Google, maybe YouTube. You should be searching for the answers because people have done it before. There's lots of amazing references. For every problem you have, someone has answered it on the internet. It's pretty extraordinary. Even like some of the most obscure command line issues, someone's talking about it on the internet. So use the internet. So our question right now is, what are these built-in elements in the HTML language? So let's ask Google. So HTML elements, and I'm going to search MDN. MDN is a nice little resource that I like for just basic references for these languages. And we can see I've clicked this link before. It's the first one that comes up. So over here on the side is a list of every element that we can create within the HTML language. And if you click on any of them, it'll give you a little description. So the one I just created is called H1. Let's scroll down and see if we can find it. Where are the headers? Here we go. So when we click on this, there'll be a little description of it. There'll be some other stuff that you don't have to worry about. Usage notes, examples, the code, really useful stuff. So MDN is a great basics reference. It's not going to give you a deep look at anything, but it will just give you the basics. Do not feel like you have to memorize these things. They are available for you online. Don't struggle with trying to find the right syntax or remembering it from the lecture. Look online and you'll see an example of exactly how to create an H1 element. On that note, how do we create an H1 element? Well, we start with our opening tag. It's going to contain 2 brackets and the name of the element inside of it. Then we can put any content inside of it, and we close it off with a closing tag. It looks just like the opening tag, but with this slash inside of it. So there you have it. That is how you create an element. And we can see that it worked because it appeared on the screen. Another thing I want to mention that's quite relevant to the HTML or to the header elements is that even though styling is done in CSS, there are a few default styles in HTML. So different elements will appear by default in different ways. Don't get too attached to those defaults, because the reality of web development out in the real world is that we write scripts that just wipe all those defaults clean so that we can start fresh. So these defaults aren't really used out in the actual production world, but they're a nice way to keep track of what you're working with at the start. As we can see, H1 by default is very large. That's because it stands for header 1, or the most important header. The #1 header for your website should be made in a H1 element. Anything in a H1 element will trigger Google searches that a search is relevant to your content. So make sure that you're only using an H1 element with important content. If you have something slightly less important, you might use an H2 or H3. And finally, if you have a header that's really not that important, you might use H6. So there are 6 headers. We can see that by default, the size is going to be different on them, but don't get too attached to that sizing thing because it can all be overwritten in CSS. So there you go. Those are the first 6 elements that you're going to learn, headers. The most important thing is knowing how to write your opening tag and your closing tag. If you have that right and you have some stuff inside of it, it should work just fine. But notice that even if I don't put anything inside of this, now we can't see it, but it's still there. That's this really important point that just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. That element still exists, it just doesn't have any content. So make sure that the code is the ultimate source of how many elements you have, not the visual. The next thing I want to show you is what's called a paragraph. Paragraphs do exactly what you would think. They're for writing slightly longer bits of text. And we can see that by default, they're slightly bigger actually than the smallest header. Paragraphs are created using P. So this is one of those precision things. It needs to be a P. It can't be the word paragraph. It has to actually be P. Same with the header. You can't write out header. It's H1, H2. You don't need to memorize these. You can always, if you can't remember, look up paragraph element HTML. It'll show you exactly how it's supposed to look. The next thing I want to show you is the div. The div is probably the most important element in JavaScript, in HTML. And it's easy to overlook because it is one of those invisible elements, at least by default. So let's say that we wanted to group some things together. So if we had a header that had to do with a paragraph, let's make it a H4. If we had this header that had to do with the paragraph and then a paragraph below it, those things are related, so we want to group them together in some way. We use a div to do that. A div is a container meant to group elements together. A couple things I want to point out. The first is that the div opening and closing tags look exactly the same as the others we've worked with. But instead of putting text inside of them, we've actually put other elements. The next thing I want to point out is that I've tabbed over the elements that are nested inside the div. That is standard. Every time you nest something, tab it over even more. So if I were to put another div inside of here, which is not only allowed but very common, anything inside of here would be nested more. So we have this pattern going on of this opening tag is right at the margin, and then the tag inside of it is tabbed over, and then the tag inside of that is also tabbed over. So it will not break your code if you fail to do this. Even if you put everything on one line, the code will not break. There are a couple exceptions, but in most languages, white space, new lines don't matter. They're ignored when the code is interpreted. However, do not neglect the tabbing. Very easy thing to justify doing at the beginning, but you're making a really bad habit for yourself. Precision isn't just important in syntax. It's also really important when it comes to your tabbing in white space. And that's because you want to be able to read your code and your fellow developers want to be able to read. And what seems to make sense to you right now will not make sense to you in 15 minutes or definitely not next week. So make sure that you're using good tabbing in white space to help you and any fellow developers read your code. So once again, if you're trying to remember exactly how the tabbing should look, don't just rack your memory. Google code examples of HTML, and you'll be able to see samples of how the tabbing is supposed to look. So there we have divs. As I mentioned, they are by default invisible, but to give you guys a sense of them, I'm going to go ahead and add a little style here. Let's do orange. So don't worry about what's going on in the CSS. We'll go over that in detail tomorrow. I just added a little bit of code to show you where the div exists. And in fact, even though it was totally invisible before, we can see, I spelled nesting wrong. We can see that there's actually this big orange rectangle here. And that rectangle was always there. It just wasn't orange before. It was just the same color as the background. And if we want to get even crazier, we could, all right, I'm going to do something here that's a preview of what we'll see tomorrow. Don't worry about it though. So if we want to, notice that there is a div nested inside of our div. So there's a div out here, there's a pink div inside of it, and there's actually a paragraph inside of that pink div. So even though there's not much space on screen, there's actually several elements all nested together. So don't rely on looking just at your browser to tell how many elements are there, because sometimes there's a lot more than you would think all crammed into one space. All right, so the final element I want to teach you tonight is called the span. And the span is kind of like the div in that it's just a container and it's invisible by default, but it's used to highlight out single words or single bits of text inside of a paragraph or something else. So if we wanted the word text to be purple, notice that even though I have put the text inside a span, so within this paragraph here, there's another element just around that one word. But we can't see it. Just like the div, the span is invisible to start. Of course, we can always override that using CSS. So now all of a sudden, whereas before it seemed to be invisible, there is now a black box surrounding text. So we can actually see where that span is. So that's really nice if you need to style something different within a line without breaking it up. And spans are really nice because they're perfect for just nesting elements inside of longer bits of text. Like in this code base example, these missing words I had, I did that trick using span elements around the words I wanted to make invisible. All right, so those are the 4 elements. We're only, I mean, technically more because there are 6 headers, but we're only learning those 4 for tonight. And they're a great place to start. You'll find that a lot of HTML follows the same pattern of opening tag, content, closing tag. So just using those 4, you'll have a chance to create your own awesome, weird little website tonight. And that will just give you an introduction to how to work with these. Tomorrow, we'll go into how to do a couple more sophisticated things. Like I'll teach you what I did to make that pink with this ID. I'm going to get rid of it though. You don't get to learn about IDs till tomorrow. So that is it. A couple other things I want to show you actually. So we started out with this Lambda School website, and we were able to see a few examples of what's going on with HTML or CSS just by looking at it. But if we want to learn more about it, we can actually see what's going on behind the scene with an inspect tool. And I even saw a few people chatting about it earlier. So some of you guys are already aware of this. If you want it, so okay, we have a couple headers here. We can tell they're different elements because when I double click them, it only highlights one at a time. So this text that I've highlighted here, what element do you guys think it is? Any guesses in the chat channel? H1. We have a suggestion of H1, H2. All right, everyone's pretty sure it's an H. I have a lot of votes for 1, a few votes for 2. We can find out for sure. So highlight it, right click it, and it's slightly different depending on your browser. In Chrome, it's called inspect, but it'll involve the word inspect. I think in some browsers, it's called inspect element. Click on this. And you guys have your first exposure to the developer tools. It turns out that there is a whole little world for developers built into your browsers. So I know some of you guys knew this already, but a lot of you guys just learned something new about, a web browser, which is a tool you thought you knew. So we're learning all the secrets. And it turns out you guys were right. It is an H1. We can confirm that. The actual code for it is over here. And if you guys didn't believe me before about divs being really important or about there being tons of elements you didn't know about, you should believe me now because these 2 headers are in a div, which is in something called a section, which is in another div, which is in another div. And above it, there's another div, and that's in another div, which is in the body. So divs for days. You will be inspecting some elements, some websites for your homework tonight. And if you do that tonight for the homework, and if you just keep doing that on your own, you will learn that divs are everywhere, everywhere. All right. So speaking of the homework, let's take a look at that. So the homework is going to be in, I'm going to go ahead and change the view. It's a little easier to see like this. Cool. Okay. So the homework will be in CodePen. We got kind of creative because we wanted your homework to all be in one spot. So listen for instructions here. There's also instructions written in. So you're going to start out with exercise 1. And I know it's in the JavaScript tab. It's not actual JavaScript. You're just going to be reflecting. So there are these questions. Just type your answers over here. This homework assignment will not be graded. So don't worry about like saying the right thing or trying to say the thing you're supposed to. This first assignment is for you. It's all about you reflecting on what you've learned and what you want to get out of this class and Lambda School at large. So spend some time on it. It's good. These are good questions to answer from the get-go. And you'll see that one of these questions involves doing what we did live of going through and looking at sites and trying to find examples of HTML and CSS. Okay, exercise 2 will use the inspector at large. You get to pick a website, you get to inspect, and you have to do a bunch of cool things. You'll have to find things. At one point, you'll have to change something. Let me show you how that works. So if I wanted this H1 to instead be a P, I could mess with it. So we can go through and actually mess with the code. in here. So try that out, see if you can get it to do anything weird. It's kind of fun. Okay, so this is all about inspecting. And this is one of those cases where, remember what I said about being overwhelmed or plunged into the unknown? This will give you a chance to do that, because it turns out that even seemingly simple websites have a lot going on. So don't panic if you open the inspector and feel overwhelmed. That's the point. That's the point of this assignment, is you're supposed to feel overwhelmed. But if you play around and tinker, you'll be able to do it, I promise. The very last assignment is all about code writing. So once you're done, you'll just slide over this JavaScript thing. There is some code in CSS. Just leave this alone. If you finish early, you can play with it, but for now, leave it alone. So you have to create a simple About Me website. So we have a few requirements about different elements you need. We've created borders for all of them, so they're color-coded, so you'll be able to easily see this is a div, this is a header, this is a paragraph. We've provided a little starting point for you with the code. You're welcome to swap out the values and keep this, or just wipe it and start from scratch. So have fun with this one. The best part about learning HTML and CSS is you get to make really ugly websites, so embrace it. And those are the 3 assignments. As far as how to actually do them and submit them and all that, it's pretty straightforward, but a little confusing. So I'll say it a few times. You will go to this link. This link is available in the syllabus. It is also is set in the Slack channel. So you will, the topic of the Slack channel includes this link. It will say Lesson 1, Intro to Web Development, a pen by Lambda School. This is the important part. In order to save your work, you need to fork it. Forking just means you create a copy on your own account. So don't start working on it before you fork it. Fork it first. When it says Intro to Web Development, a pen by your name, you know you've done it correctly. You'll also see that there's a save button that appears. So make sure you fork it and then save it when you're done. There's no submit button. We will check completion based on the information you provided for us when you signed up for the course. So we will have access to this just via your CodePen. So we will be checking it, but we won't be formally grading this or any of your other assignments. I apologize for that. It's just one of those things. It's a free class. We can't quite afford to do that. We felt that our resources were better spent on making TAs available to you, which they will be. The good news is that you're creating a website. What you're writing will appear live down here, so you can see what you're doing. If you have questions, if you're stuck, Google, reach out in Slack, or if you're really stuck and not getting anywhere, you're welcome to message me directly. I can't always respond right away, but if you're stuck on something and you reach out to me, I will get back to you and I will help you with it. I just ask that you not take advantage of that privilege and check Google first, check in Slack second, and then if you're stuck, you can reach out to me directly. That being said, as I said at the beginning, you're always welcome to reach out to me if you have any feedback or issues or anything like that. I'm happy to help. I am here for that. Not always going to respond right away, though. I will warn you. Okay, so that's the homework for tonight. What else do we have? So before we do the Q&A, I want to come back to this question we mentioned at the beginning of what is a software engineer? So in the most literal sense, it's someone who knows how to build things with code. So it is important that you learn how to code to be a software engineer. That's one of the things we're teaching you. But I do not think that is the most important thing that we're teaching you, and I don't think it's the most important part of being a software engineer. I think there's really 2 sides to 2 more important things. And one thing was brought up already by one of you guys, which is that you're always learning. For one, there's always some crazy problem that's going to come up that you haven't seen before. This is not a monotonous field. You will see new things every day. You'll have to actually be awake at your job, which kind of sucks. I had to take a few personal days off just for the fact of I couldn't sleep, because unlike when I used to work the food industry and back in college, I couldn't really show up to my programming job on 2 hours of sleep and actually do a good job, because it's not monotonous. You're always being thrown new problems and new issues. So being able to learn and adapt on the fly is critical. It's also critical because the field is always changing. We're teaching you the most up-to-date technologies, but they will be different in 5 years. There are things that I am teaching in this course that didn't exist 3 years ago when I went through my own boot camp. So don't worry, because it doesn't mean that you're like going to be phased out after a couple of years. It just means you're going to have to learn new skills on the job. And in the spirit of that is the other most important thing, which is being able to find the answer. So finding the answer is more important than having the answer, which is why Googling is the most important skill. You will hear me tell you to Google like 80 more times before the end of next week. Just warning you, I'm going to say it a lot. I'm going to say it to the point of being annoying because it's important. And I know that the kind of typical personality of that, there are of course many people in coding, but a very common personality in coding, myself included, can be a little proud and wants to think they have the answer. So it took me a while to just like realize it's okay to not know. It's okay to ask, and ask the internet, because the internet always has an answer. On that note, you will see a few like jerk programmers who answer to Stack Overflow questions and are like, oh, I can't believe you don't know this, but don't pay them any mind. They don't matter. Okay, well, that is all I have for you guys for tonight. I will do a Q&A now. Please put your questions in the Q&A section in Zoom, not in the chat. I'll be paying attention to the Q&A section. My first priority is answering questions about coding. I will ask any administration or like admissions questions if I can. Any questions about what it's like to be a programmer. It's pretty broad for this first night. So let's see. Where is the attendance form? There's a link to the attendance form in the syllabus if you have that. I can also post the attendance form again in Slack after this, after I end this session for anyone who doesn't have it. What does Lambda get out of giving free classes? Really good question. I'm assuming you mean that this free intro course. So there are a few things that we get out of it as a company. For me personally, I'm happy to get paid to teach whoever. But from Lambda School's perspective, the first thing is that we don't want to waste time and resources on people who aren't sure that they want to do this. So it's our way of assuring that if you come into the program, you've had enough exposure to know that this is something you like, you're good at, and that you want. In the spirit of that, it also helps people get ready for the admissions. We want to make sure that people have a certain level of dedication and competency before we admit them. Putting them through this course helps us guarantee that that's the case. Finally, there are a lot of people who are on the fence about Lambda School or curious about Lambda School. People who might not sign up for Lambda School if they didn't have exposure to it. So this allows us to have people who are maybe iffy about the program. We give them a taste of the program, and if we do a good job, hopefully they're more likely to sign up for it. And I guess the last reason would be if people are just Googling for resources, they might find our videos on YouTube and learn more about Lambda School. So it's really actually quite useful for us across the board. All right, there are tons of questions all of a sudden now. I shouldn't have spent so much time on that. What advice do you have for first-time coders? That's a great question. With respect to this class, my biggest piece of advice would be kind and patient to yourself. This class is really fast-paced if you're a brand new coder. So if you have some coding experience or have coded in a different language, you'll probably find the pace of this class it's maybe a little challenging, but about right. If you're brand new to coding, it will be hard for you to keep up with the pace of this class. And I'm not saying that to be discouraging. I'm actually saying that because I don't want you to fall into thinking you're not good or you don't have what it takes. If you're brand new to coding, you will probably have to work outside of the class. You might have to take the class a second time. It's a pretty common thing. So I would just say be patient, ask questions, another bit of advice I have is if you get the code to work but you don't understand how it works, don't just move on. Take the time to understand why it works. I see people are asking for the syllabus as well. I believe the syllabus is in Slack in the topic. So there's a topic set on the channel for this class, and should be a link to the syllabus in that. I'll double check that after we're done here.
Yeah, I can weigh in on that. It's just at the top of the page. So at the top of the page in Slack, if you scroll over at the topic part, you'll be able to find our syllabus. You'll be able to find the homework assignment for the evening, and you'll be able to find their stand-up form, which we'll be using later. We'd like you to fill out, okay?
Okay, we have a question. How does payment work if we intend to work for ourselves after graduation? That is an interesting question. I'm assuming it would still just be the same percentage. If you're working full time, it would still be the same percentage of your salary or whatever you're making. But that would be a better question for Karen. That actually is a good question for me to ask her too, because that one has never come up for me before. Okay, a question about someone who's working on the challenge right now, but it's not letting them pass. So I would reach out to myself in Slack about that. So that's kind of a specific question for you personally. What is the course code? It's a FSW, Full Stack Web Development, MBC, Mini Bootcamp. So you really just need to know FSW and then today's date. And by the way, that attendance form is just for tonight. So once you filled it out once, you're fine. Can I explain the div again? Yes, a coding question. Awesome. So the div is a container. It's used for grouping like items together. So actually, let me use this example. So notice that we have this nice little pretty blue box that everything is contained in. So we needed to create an element to act as a container for our header, our paragraph, and our button. So this is a div. It's good we'll just talk about it from a style perspective right now, but there are other reasons to group things in a div. From a style perspective, if you wanted something to have a uniform color or a border, or to be tabbed or spaced in a uniform way, you would put it all in a div. So then you could move all the elements together and style them uniformly. So just without CSS, divs can kind of be like, whoa, what are they? But they really are this building block that actually structure how things are grouped together. And it's really important for style and also just important for the functionality of your website. All right, what else? Where can I find the assignment for homework? It is also in the Slack topic. It's also in the syllabus. So those are two places you can find the link for that. Question about how to submit the assignment. So you just save it. There's no formal submission. As long as it's saved, we will have access to it. What happens after the 2 weeks introductory class? Good question. So it depends on how the class went. For a lot of students, I would say most students, what happens after the 2-week class is a period of going over and looking at old videos and catching up on any homework assignments that you didn't finish. For some students, it means retaking the class. That's a pretty common thing that happens. So you might get more than 2 weeks of me. The other thing that would happen if you're feeling comfortable, if you've gone through and you more or less understand all the concepts in the homework, is it would be time for you to start your application process if you are wanting to attend Lambda School. So there's a code challenge you will have to pass in order to start your admissions process to Lambda School. If you feel ahead of the curve, you're welcome to take that sooner. If not, just wait until the class is done. If you felt pretty good about the homework, you should be fine on the challenge. And if you're curious about anything involving that, just ask Karen. All right. Would I recommend the full-time, full-stack class with someone with a full-time job? So no. And in fact, the full-time class, there's pretty much no way to attend it if you have a job unless you work night shifts and don't need sleep, because live attendance is required. And even though it's an online class, that doesn't mean it's an at your own pace, at your own leisure class. You are required to be present at Lambda School basically during the work week while you attend the full-time class. So that's really not possible if you're working full-time. However, we do have a part-time option, and it runs in the evenings with some work on Saturdays. So that is tough. It's a tough option, and it takes a full year. It runs at half pace of the regular course. But if you're wanting to work and attend Lambda concurrently, we do have that part-time option. Question about these videos. Yes, so the videos go up on YouTube after the class. They don't go up right away, unfortunately. It just takes a little bit of time to get them up. But by the end of the evening, and certainly by the next day, they will be available online. If you want, you can always look at videos from a previous section. There are some linked in the syllabus. The classes do change a little bit from section to section, but it should cover more or less the same material each time. So that would be a good option if you want a video reference right away. Your CodePen account, I believe the CodePen account is linked in through the attendance form. I will need to double check how we link that in, but it should have been taken care of when you signed up, but I'll have to double check on that. We've changed the format of the class a few times with that. Okay. Someone wants to review the fork and save piece. So yeah, you just have to press fork. If you see your name next to a pen by, you've done it right, and then save it. It'll say pen saved. Super simple. The course code is FSW for Full Stack Web. Let's see. Question, is there other pre-course work? Nope, this is the pre-course work. So you will be, you will be required to have completed all the homework for this course before you start Lambda School, but that is the pre-course work. Okay. Okay, we have a question about spacing in HTML. So all the spacing issues, and when I say spacing, and I mean like how much space is between, you know, the header and the paragraph, or the side of the box and the header, that's all CSS, and we'll talk about that tomorrow night. A good question about Lambda, do we help find a job? And I'll be talking about that in detail some point this week, maybe next week, but yes, absolutely. So we have in fact, we just got a bunch of funding to Lambda School as a company, and it is almost all going to our job resources. We want to teach you guys and give you guys the best education possible, but we also know that the reason you come to Lambda School is to get that job afterwards. So we put our time and energy and resources as a company into making sure that happens. So we have partnerships with a lot of companies. So in many cases, we can actually connect you directly with a company. Even in the cases that doesn't work out, we still have a hiring process. So we have teams helping you with resumes, helping you keep track and keep you accountable for the hiring process. So we absolutely help you. Lambda School ends when you get the job. Can I expect this page? Yeah, that's actually a good idea. This is a little bit less intimidating than, for example, the Lambda School site. So we can see that there's a body. That's everything in the background. There is a div. Wait a minute. This is being weird. Okay, so we have a button, we have a paragraph, a header. The div is highlighting, oh, because of the margin. Okay, so yeah, we'll learn more about this tomorrow, but notice that the div is highlighted outside of where the blue box is. That's because of something called a margin, which we'll learn about tomorrow. And then finally the body. So there you have it. That's the web page. All right, you guys have a ton of questions. I'm gonna start to skim them and try and answer the most relevant. I'm sorry, please ask them in Slack if you wanna know, but I also wanna make sure you have time for homework. Question about what happens if I apply for the full-time course before this course with little coding background. So in order to get an interview for Lambda School, you have to pass a coding challenge. If you want to just try it out and you have some experience, and you're not ready for it, it's not like we're going to blacklist you. We let you try it a couple times. If you're trying it again and again and not making any progress, we might tell you to move on. But if you do know some JavaScript and you want to try the challenge, go for it. If you don't know much JavaScript, there's really not much of a point. If you find out you're not quite ready for it, that's totally fine. You're welcome to then take this course and do it again after the fact. All right. Attendance. Yeah, so for this class, live attendance is very much encouraged, but if you have to miss a night or 2 or 10, hopefully not 10 since there are 10, that's okay. You can do this self-paced. Either you can catch up on a class or you could do the entire course self-paced, because all of the videos are on YouTube. You just won't be able to participate in the Q&As or talk to other people in Slack while they're working on homework. Oh, apparently there is another, let's see. Okay, things are just coming on in. Oh, I'm gonna do one more question because I love this question. I am not from a computer science background. Can I get a job? Absolutely. So I personally have a math background, which is a technical background. And I had exposure to computer science in college. And I will admit it made life easier when finding a job. But I was, I think, the only one in my entire course who had a technical background. So most of the people who go through do not have a technical background. And many of the best coders I've ever met don't even have college degrees, much less a technical background. So it sometimes can be a barrier. It depends on the company. If you're trying to, I know I worked for a larger company and we didn't care in terms of hiring. We just wanted people who were good. But sometimes if you, for example, didn't have a college degree at all, it would be difficult for you to get promotions because of the bureaucracy. So there are still these structures in place that interfere, which sucks because we're programmers, we're practical people. We just mostly care if you know this stuff. So my experience is that it's not much of a barrier. It can be a leg up if you do have it, but it's very common that people who do not have any sort of technical background and sometimes don't even have college degrees go out and get good jobs. You just have to have a good portfolio and demonstrate that you've learned and you know what you're doing. And these immersives are becoming more and more accepted. As I said, when I was working in the field, it was standard for us. We hired one person out of the UT program, the University of Texas CS program. And honestly, they were not the best coder. I hope he never sees this video, but yeah, my most competent colleagues were pretty consistently self-taught or out of boot camps. Would I recommend getting a college degree? That's kind of I'll give you my personal opinion, which is dangerous, but my personal opinion is you shouldn't spend 4 years of your life and go into debt unless you have a very good reason to do that. So not a big believer in get a college degree by default, or that, you can't be someone if you don't have a degree. Pretty big believer that you should, learn the skills you need to do what you want to do. And if that involves a degree, good for you. If it doesn't, oh well. And, not everybody agrees with that. And in life, you might find some barriers if you don't have a degree, but, you got to create your own reality. So getting a little into my personal philosophy there, that might be too much for night one. But all right, that's a good time for us to call it. So let's go ahead and I'm going to unshare my screen. So I know there were a lot of questions that went unanswered. Please ask questions in Slack. If they're related to admissions, you're welcome to reach them out to Karen directly. And all the links you need are in the topic. This video will be available hopefully later tonight, by tomorrow at the latest. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you for a great first class. You guys have been super interactive. I love all the questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get all of them. And I will see you tomorrow where we will learn more HTML and some CSS. Have a great night, you guys.